You ready?
Well, let me just get started. Well, so this is Ella Cerrone reporting for James Cole. Today we are going to be talking about what you've learned from entrepreneurship in your 5 years of doing so. So first of all, a little base work. What were you doing before you decided to become an entrepreneur?
I went to college. I went to a really intense college, Princeton University. It's also a liberal arts college, so you don't specialize in anything per se, meaning you study like art history and philosophy, and they say that they teach you how to think is the way they explain it. So I didn't really have a specialty or a craft or a idea of what industry I wanted to get into. I knew I was creative, and I knew I wanted to be around other creative people. And I knew that because I was raised in an intense household and so on, that I wanted to work in like a legitimate industry. I tried being a photographer in college, like in the summers. I tried I worked for a newspaper as a photographer in Hong Kong, which was really cool. But I just kind of realized like I'm not good enough, nor do I have enough passion to be an artist, say. So I decided to kind of do what all my friends were doing, which was go to like a very legitimate firm. Except for me, it wasn't a law firm or a bank or a, accounting firm. Or consulting firm. It was an ad agency. So I worked at a big ad agency and I cut my teeth there. I think the main lessons I learned there was just how to be an adult, how to work a job, how to send an email, how to make a cogent argument in a tight way, that kind of thing. And I learned a bit about how big advertising works, but also mostly how it doesn't work. And I had a lot of instincts as a very young person about like, this doesn't feel right to me. Like this doesn't make sense how they're doing this. And I sort of had this private theory, like this is going to collapse, but sort of just was like, I'm young, so let me check that. Like I might not know what the fuck I'm talking about. And sort of you'll get it when you're older. Like maybe I'll mature into understanding this. But because of a lot of things, the internet, social media, et cetera, and COVID, not the least of which, ad agencies of old, the ones on Madison Avenue that you hear about in the show Mad Men, are just crumbling into the ocean, just absolutely. The one I worked at had 6,000 employees, and they got forcibly taken over by a small digital agency that had 50 employees when I worked there. So it just kind of puts things into perspective. And then I went and left. I left New York on a whim. I had a bad romantic relationship and needed a change. So I went to San Francisco. I ran content for a company, which sounded very important and exciting. But it was just a shit show startup with 26 employees. Half the company got fired a couple months in. Just a complete shit show. And I just watched it burn to the ground over the course of a year that I was there. Ended up working for free for my last 2 months because they just had no money. And then I left and started the hub. Yeah.
And then what was like the aha moment that gave you the idea to do the hub?
Well, I think there was like, when they talk about how Trump became president or how Hitler rose to power, like they always talk about the fertile soil, like what could have given rise to something like that? Like what was at play? And I think when you add together, like working at a big ad agency for almost 4 years and kind of like wanting to hit my head against a wall every day, after the first year or so where I was learning and getting better, it was mostly just cyclical, boring bullshit and being like, there's got to be a better way. And then going to a startup, getting put in charge of a department, feeling scared shitless, like big time imposter syndrome. I'm not good enough. How did I sneak in? How did I convince them that I could run a department? I'm 25 years old. I have no idea what the fuck I'm doing. And then realizing that no one knows what they're doing, which is a truism of life, which was made appallingly obvious by the fact that this company was just on fire, like had to fire half its employees, was plummeting into the ground. It was valued at 40 million bucks when I started, and it sold for less than 5 million 2 years later. So it just literally into the ground. And so while I was there, Ella, no one that was my boss had any time to worry about what I was working on or thinking about because they had way bigger problems. And at first that was really scary because I'd always had structure I'd always been in college and had like a deadline and a professor, or I'd had a big ad agency with a boss who had a boss who had a boss. And so all of a sudden, basically not having anyone to tell me what to do or what not to do was very scary. And I had a couple sleepless nights, which I'd never had in my life. Like, I went to Princeton's, very intense place. I never pulled an all-nighter once. I just didn't care enough. Like, I was just like, I'll get a B minus, I'll get a C plus, I'll get the grade I get. And at Y&R, it was sort of easy and mindless work. And so I never really, a few weekends here and there, I'd have to grind a little bit, but that's about it. At We Heart It, at the startup I worked at, I had nights where I couldn't sleep because I knew that I had things to accomplish. I had no idea how to accomplish them. I had no leadership. The company was burning. It was very stressful. And I just like felt immense ownership of like my goals for the first time. And that was really overwhelming. And I think I probably could have gone either way. I could have like broken and been like, fuck this, I'm out, and just like quit, or like decided that I'm not cut out for this. And I had a few nights where like I was leaning that way. The CEO was like a family friend who hired me. And I felt like I couldn't leave because of that dynamic. I didn't want to like sully my family's relationship with this guy. So I stuck it out. And one night in particular, they flew me down to Huntington Beach to film something. And it was a disaster. And I stayed up all night figuring out how to fix it. And I did. And it was really vindicating that I like figured it out and I fixed the problem. And when I got back, they didn't particularly care because, again, it was just sort of a small thing in the grand scheme of the company being on fire. But for me, it was a big aha moment of like, okay, I can look fear in the face. I can look failure in the face, and I can like stay up all night and figure it out. Like I have that inside me. And from that moment on, I just sort of like I started running towards the fire instead of running away from it. And so I think the entrepreneur in me was sort of awakened, right? Like it's always been there. I started a t-shirt company when I was 18. I always had schemes and projects and stuff. And I was even a little kid. My mom tells me stories today that I've forgotten from when I was 6 and I did this but I think that person was sort of dormant and sort of neutered, to use a charged word, at Princeton University or at my big ad agency. And I think it was awakened again at We Heart It when everything was on fire. And I just sort of realized that I'm a firefighter. I'm not the person running away from the fire. Like I had to figure that out. So that's the fertile soil. And then my aha moment really was an aha moment. I've had like 2 or 3 of these in my life. I'm not religious, nor am I like the universe has, a way of telling me things kind of guy. Like I just sort of think that things happen. But I've had a few moments in my life that feel almost like there was divine intervention or like a lightning bolt just struck. And I was getting increasingly pissed off at We Heart It. And I was in charge of content. And I'd been working like a dog and I wanted to take a vacation, but I couldn't. So I decided to travel and make content in different countries because we had a very international user base. So I wanted to create content for different people in different countries. So I was in Berlin making content for our German audience. We had 40 million users, so we probably had a couple million in Germany. So I like literally friends of friends, like I just like touched down, made all this content in Berlin. And I'm staying in this like Airbnb, this funky Berlin. It was so cool. And it was like $80 a night. And it was just like this hip Berlin. So I was feeling like a scrappy, artisty entrepreneur type. And I was kind of jet lagged. And I woke up at 2 a.m. and the whole thing was there. Like the whole idea for my company, like everything made sense. I even had the name, like everything just hit me like a ton of bricks. And I called my dad because it was 2 a.m. in Berlin which means it was whatever that is, like, 8 p.m. in New York. So I call my pop and I'm like, I think I'm going to do this. And I explained it to him, and I've made that call to my dad a few times. Like, I have this kooky idea and I'm going to do it. And I kind of have a reputation in my friend circles and in my families for having crazy ideas. But when I have clarity like that, somehow it hits his ear different. And instead of writing me off or being like, yeah, which my family and friends often do, my dad was like, yeah, like that, you should do this. So that's what happened.
And then walk me through what, how did you get it off the ground? What was the first month like? What were the first 6 months like? What did you learn in that time that you then, adjusted to the first year? Were there any surprises? Just walk me through it.
Part of why I left We Hearted is because I had started the hub. So I'd started this concept of like building content with lots of people. I basically met a couple very, 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 very early influencers, because this was before influencer marketing. So this is right when Instagram went public, where you could have a public profile and people had like 10 or 20,000 followers, which was like a ton compared to the normal person who had 400. And I met some of those people. And one of them was named Jacory, who was basically my right hand. Like, he was my first hire when I started the company. Jacory was 19. And I'd pay him $300 a shoot. And he was super scrappy. And he just made like $5,000 a month. And then I hired him on salary. We Hearted as my number 2 for $5,000 a month. And Jacory's job became finding a network of people, all his friends, all these other little influencers that were 19 and had 10,000, 20,000 followers and like some skill. He started Ponzi scheme has obviously a very negative connotation, but like Jacory found people who found people and who found people. And all of a sudden I had like 30 or 40 kids who were part of this network that were making content for We Heart It. And that's how I was able to make an obscene amount of content for a pretty big app on a shoestring. And so the last straw with We Heart It was there were $20,000 in invoices due to these young creators that I'd like really started building relationships with and met in person and so on. And the CEO had greenlit the whole thing. And then he reneged and said that we had to default on the payment. So he wasn't going to pay all these young kids. So I had like 4K in the bank saved up from my high paying advertising job, which I think paid me 45K. So I had $4,000 in the bank. So I called my dad and asked him if I could borrow 16K, because it just seemed like such an injustice that these kids that had been working their ass off for me wouldn't get the 20K. Again, there were like 30 of them. So it's probably $800 a person or something. It wasn't that big of a deal, but it was a big deal. And so my dad lent me the money and I paid back the kids, the 20K. And I worked for free at We Heart It and said, as soon as you can pay me back, I'm leaving. So 2 months later, they paid me back the 20K and I left. And I asked my dad, like, hey, I can keep my 4K and give you back the 16, but I have this idea. You seem to like it. Would you be willing to like be my seed investor and let me keep the 16K? And he did. So I had 20K to start the company. So that's how I started it, was with 20K, Jacory, and the relationships that he had helped me build at We Heart It. And that was like the original incarnation. Jacory went to high school with like a hustler who'd built an Instagram for trucks. And he'd grown it to like 50,000 followers, which was a shit ton back in those days. His name's Miguel. So Miguel joined the team about 2 or 3 weeks after. We had our first meeting with Miguel to interview him at We Heart It's offices. And we started our Instagram that day that grew 100,000 followers in 5 months that Miguel ran. That was his job. And the password on our Instagram was family3. And we're like, we're starting this for the right reasons. And there are 3 of us. And if this grows and there become more, we need to remember where we started and remember this room in this moment. So we made this family three, like we're a unit of three and nothing's going to come between that. And things indeed did come between that. Both of them left the company, both quit after a couple years. I haven't spoken to Ja'Cory since. Miguel just sent me a very nice note. I hadn't spoken to him in years. But Ja'Cory, Miguel, and then a couple weeks after that, a really talented photographer in San Francisco named Zach Leung. He had 6,000 followers on Instagram, but very talented and was growing very quickly. He was a pizza boy and he was making $250 a week. So I said, I'll pay you $250 a week if you quit tomorrow. So he quit tomorrow. Then I had to match it. Ja'Cory and Miguel were working for free just for equity at first because we were just not even a thing yet. So I paid them each $250 a week out of my checking account, out of the 20K that I had. And so $750 a week was our burn, which is a lot. And that's how we started. And we took a trip to my folks' cabin in Massachusetts with all the top influencers of the day, Brendan Woelfel, Noel Avarenga, Sam Elkins. These were gods of the early influencer marketing day. And they all came out to my family's cabin, which was free. And we had our first H event, which was like 15, 20 people. It was 10 people, I guess. Like 10 of the top influencers all crammed in this little cabin. There's a video of it, which is funny. Just all these people from my past. And I don't talk to any of those people anymore, but that's where it began. It began very honestly with 3 people in a room and just wide eyes and excitement about what we were doing and believing in something. And we had hundreds of meetups and events and gallery shows, and we were just super scrappy. And we just made that 20K last a really long time, and probably lasted about 6 months, that 20K. And we grew our Instagram to over 100,000 followers in that time. We grew an email list of over 6,000 people that became the first members of the hub as it exists today. We built a very loyal base of followers, many of whom are still photographers on our platform today. So we laid the groundwork for this community that way.
Was there anything that you thought, was going to be the secret or the recipe to success when you first got started that a year later you were like, I was wrong? Or even like 3 years later, something that was working just wasn't working anymore? And how did you kind of come to that conclusion, and what did you do to rectify it?
Ella, I think as just a human being, like even if people are watching right now that aren't entrepreneurs, like you, Ella, thought that a guy was the right guy for you and he ended up not being, or a job was the right job for you and ended up not being, or a city was the right city and ended up not being. And like, there are a lot of things that you think pretty clearly when you're 22 and then you are wrong a year later or two. And that's true for entrepreneurs, and probably 10x as true, which is to say, you need to have laser focus. You need to believe. You need to really think that what you're doing is right. Because if you don't, it's really like the world's betting against you. So you have to have a lot of belief. But definitionally, you don't know what the fuck you're doing. It's so high risk. It's so much chance. There's so many variables, particularly with a marketplace. Photographers, brands, software. There are 3 things. And so there's an exponential number of things that can go wrong. So I could give you thousands of examples of times where I was sure that I was right about something, and months or years later couldn't have been more wrong. And it's just about every day waking up and having that I'm sure moment and being able to project out a year, and then being very prepared to wake up the next day and actually alter the path a little bit, and being okay, being ever confident, but ever humble always. So that said, I'll give myself some credit, and I'll say like a lot of my read on this space, like I wrote some articles, Ella, that you can include in the article for this post, I wrote them like before we were an LLC. I remember writing one in May of 2016 about how influencer marketing was not going to work. And I had very prescriptive reasons why. And I was right. Um, I was right about starting with community and building this deeply emotionally connected group of people before monetizing it. Those are the right instincts. Um, I was right about prioritizing quality because I knew that this space was going to trend just like fashion did with fast fashion, moving from J. Crew to like H&M and Zara and Forever 21, or just like food did, moving from what our parents grew up on to like Kraft macaroni and cheese and Lunchables. Like there's this trend towards mass producing and highly processing food, clothing. Same thing happened with content, and the same thing happened with influencers. There's this high commoditization that occurred, and I saw that coming. And so a lot of the decisions I made in the very early days were to build a moat around quality, around community, around things that I knew would be rarer and rarer commodities. And that's proven very true. So I'd say my macro instincts were dead on, but thousands and thousands of smaller instincts and decisions and thoughts were, completely wrong and continue to be.
What are, I mean, maybe 2 or 3 of the most valuable lessons that you've learned in this time, and why?
Team is everything. It's sort of a truism. I said in a talk recently that if you don't give away 60% of your company, I've just put an arbitrary number on it, but I think it's a punchier statement if you do. If you don't give away 60% of your company as a founder in the first year, you're doing it wrong. Usually most of that is a co-founder. So like if you start a company with someone, you each have 50%. So there's 50% right there. And then your first couple employees might get 3, 4, 5, 6% each. So that's kind of what I mean by that. Or an investor or an advisor that you really respect and like. I used money because I had that 20K, and then I raised some more from friends and family. And out of insecurity, it wasn't like defensiveness. It wasn't like I want to keep my company. It was more like I don't want other people to have to take on risk. So Ella, if I met you in the early days of the company and I'm like, I can't pay you your rate as a writer, how about you get 1% of my company and I'll pay you quarter rate. Like that's how a lot of startups start, right? It's like people believe and they're willing to work for cheap or free and live on a floor and eat mac and cheese. But I always said, Ella, what's your rate? Oh, that's your rate? Great, I'll pay it. Or even sometimes I'll pay extra because I know that it's scary to like join a fragile company because I watched We Heart It burn to the ground. So I didn't want people to be in that position of like, again, I worked for free for We Heart It for 2 months. Like I put shit on my personal card to make it work. And I didn't want people to have to take that on because I knew what a burden that was. So lesson number 1, build a very loyal team that's bought in and that's willing to work for mostly equity and like below market value. Because definitionally, then you align yourself with people that really believe and feel ownership of the company. And I kept all of the ownership, not out of selfishness, but out of insecurity. And I was very alone as the leader of the company. And I've only fixed that in the past 6 months. So that was a big lesson. Another big lesson would be say no to most things. Sorry.
What led you to fixing it?
It's like all intimacy, it's like slowly trusting people, slowly letting people in. I think people just stood the test of time. Shannon started as a photographer in our community. We had cash giveaways for things like if you could refer other creators onto the platform. Most people made $100 here, $100 there, and Shannon made thousands of dollars doing stuff. So I hired her full time for $40K and then gave her a raise to $48K and then another raise and then another raise and then another raise. And now she's my co-founder. So she has a big equity chunk of the company, but she started as a complete outsider, as just a random creator from Nashville when we had 20,000 people on our platform. We now have 40,000. She was like completely a nobody, and now she's everything to me. Jason is our developer and like has bled for me, and I still pay him market rate, but he's just put a lot on the line emotionally. He's in his 40s, has a big family, and he's taken on a lot of emotional baggage and risk for me. We're very close as a result. So like things like that, just trusting people, letting them in, realizing that letting people carry the load for you actually isn't an inconvenience for them, but can give them purpose and meaning too. So that's a big one. Saying no to things. Napoleon very famously wouldn't open his mail for 2 weeks. And the reason why is because he figured most of the things would work themselves out. And if he opened all his mail 2 weeks after receiving it and something was still relevant, then he would act. But 80% of the things were actually irrelevant at that point. Warren Buffett talks about writing 20 things on your to-do list every day and then crossing out 15 of them. As in, I'm not even going to focus on those. I'm just going to focus on the 5 that are the most important. So what are the 20 things you should do? And then ignore 15 of them. So a lot of these leaders of old are like, even in a world that wasn't that overwhelming, like Napoleon had mail. You and I have notifications popping up 17 ways to Sunday. So there's so many things you can do as an entrepreneur. And I did them all. I sprayed energy because I have so much energy. And then I had cash that I raised. So I sprayed cash in all different directions. And if I just said no to most things and been very focused, which the company is now, that would have served me much better. And then the last big lesson would be start really small, start really humble. Hold your breath, which is to say, like, if you can wait and delay gratification and not worry what other people think and start really small, really, really, really small, then your mistakes aren't magnified. If you start really big and you do really big, aggressive things, if you're even a little bit off, it's like a plane. If a plane's pointed 1 degree in the wrong direction, it can end up in Alaska instead of Texas, if it's flying from Europe. So if you start even a little bit off, which almost assuredly you are, because the hole-in-ones don't happen. We hear stories of Facebook or Airbnb or whatever, but like, even when you look at those stories, like I've been lucky enough to meet the founders of some very successful companies. None of them are it's like humans, right? Like it's never as easy as it seems. It's never like someone just like woke up one day successful. Like there was a lot of hard work underneath that. So the hole-in-one doesn't happen. And so definitionally you're a little bit off or a lot of bit off. And if you hit that really hard, you can end up totally in the wrong neck of the woods. If you hit it soft, you're only a little bit off, and then you can recalibrate and a little bit off and a little bit off and slowly find your way to where you're going. So start very small, start very humble. Don't be so insecure that you have to hit the ball as hard as you can right out of the gate, because almost assuredly you'll end up in the bushes,
I want to touch on something you just said about working very hard, because a lot of people in all walks of life, their idea of hard work is different, because hard is it's not a quantifiable thing; it's a qualitative thing. And previously, you also mentioned that you got your job at We Hearted in part because you were family friends with somebody who was up at the company who was able to give you that help. Speaking as somebody who comes from Condé Nast, which is basically like the bastion of nepotism in journalism, there's a lot of people in that space who get jobs, based on family friends, and then don't do a lot of hard work. So what would you want people to know about just hard work, regardless of connections or who you know or who you've been able to network with?
Entrepreneurship is life, man. Like that's such a ridiculous thing to say, but you don't win overnight it's the longest of journeys. You can't push really hard like you can't hide, right? Like what you do speaks. What you do is. So it's the ultimate, like what you do behind closed doors, or like what you do when no one's watching is who you truly are. Like there are glamorous moments as an entrepreneur, which is to say you get featured, we got featured in Forbes and things happen every now and again, but it belies the reality, which is just chopping wood. You show up every day, you work hard. Show up every day, you work hard. Show up every day, you work hard. And I'm telling you, Ella, I've had probably 15, 20, 30 moments where I'm like, this is it. This is the moment where we go from kind of cruising along to whoop. Like I met with Gary Vaynerchuk and he looked me in the eye and he's like, I'm going to help you. You're really onto something. And I've, met with other people that have been like, I've met a lot of people and like, there's something about you, like you're going to succeed. I'm going to help you. Or been featured in this or gotten that advisor. Like I've thought 15 times, Ella, that like, this is the moment where it gets easy, and it's never gotten easy. Every day has been challenging. Every day has been showing up and chopping wood. So I think like it just separates the people that there's some people that never work hard at all and they will lose right away as an entrepreneur. There's some people that know how to like fake it or work hard for a second or kind of like, do the optics, and they fail. The only people that succeed are the people that sort of quietly and humbly work hard. And I don't mean like working 80 hours a week forever and ever and ever, although there are moments where I've done that. I mean just more like consistently showing up and consistently losing and consistently getting punched in the face and setbacks and disappointments and consistently showing up again. And like, that's it. If anyone tells you differently, they're wrong. Like I know a lot of entrepreneurs, it's just showing up every day. And it's the same as life, right? Like you don't like make meaningful relationships or feel connected to your hobby by like a flash in the pan. It's like a slow burn, a slow process. Anything worth building takes time.
Well, that doesn't exactly square with what a lot of people consider entrepreneurship to be, which has kind of gotten a bit of a punchline in past years. You go on an app and somebody says they're an entrepreneur, and especially in places like New York or Los Angeles, like people are like, oh, that's code word for unemployed. So why do you think it is that entrepreneurship gets this bad rap? And, is that something that some entrepreneurs are even perpetuating in a way?
I mean, this is a tale as old as time. Like I would say if you say I'm an actor in LA, that means you're unemployed. If you say I'm a singer-songwriter in Nashville, that means you're unemployed. Statistically speaking, it means you're like, if you say you're a writer, like, plenty of people that are like, I'm a writer. It's like, no, you're not. You write, but no one reads it. Right. So saying you're an entrepreneur in 2020 just means that you are trying to build something and you're probably failing at it, because most people do, myself included. Right. So I think just like, the allure of moving to LA and following your dreams is a lie for most people. Like most people don't actually succeed in that quest. Like most people don't become George Clooney. Most people don't get a record deal. And most entrepreneurs don't have an exit. 90% of startups fail. 70% of startups with venture backing, like $1 million+ of VC money, 70% of those fail. So you get $1 million or 2 or 5 or 10 or 20, and those companies, 70% of them fail. So there's a lot of, I think, there's this thing, right, Ella? There are these huge trends of people would say millennials are entitled. I don't know if I'd go that far, but there's this attitude of like, I can do what I want. I can be who I want. And there's so many layers to this, right? Like we have access to everything. You can get pad thai. You can buy tickets to Rome. You can order up a date on Tinder. You can like get what you want in seconds. You can Amazon Prime something. There's an immediacy to all of our lives. And so there's an expectation that your dreams will be the same, that you want to be a successful entrepreneur, you want to be a singer songwriter in Nashville or whatever, and that you're going to snap your fingers and you're going to get there. And society perpetuates this lie that because the people that have quasi succeeded and then people that are faking it fill our feeds, right? Like there are all these ads of people that are like successful entrepreneurs. But the reality, statistically speaking, is that it's really, really hard. And so just like the girl who packs up her car and drives from Ohio to go out to LA and become an actress, but she waits tables for 4 years and then gives up and moves back to Ohio, that's the story of entrepreneurs.
Was there anything about your idea of entrepreneurship that you had at the beginning that just you were absolutely off base about? And what was that journey for recognizing that for you?
Yeah, I mean, all of these are truisms, Ella. Like, I really do believe that entrepreneurship's a great metaphor for life. So a lot of the things I'm going to say are like things that everyone says, they're cliches, but I now feel them very deeply. So like, I think the biggest misconception I had was that it was a destination, not a journey, right? That like, for me, entrepreneurship was a way of, it was like a lightning rod for my temperament. Like I'm really high energy, so it just seemed like a good fit. And I thought that I could, to all my friends and family who I think judge me for being like a little wacky and a little high energy, it seemed like a good place to put a lot of energy, succeed in a relatively short time frame, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and have everyone point at me and go, oh, he's visionary, not crazy. He's capable, not impulsive. It seemed like a quick way to prove myself. So a lot of the impetus for why I started my company and like got into entrepreneurship, and other than the push of like we hard at failing and kind of like having the beginnings of a company and excitement, a lot of it was like self-hatred and a desire to prove myself to the world. And I needed a trophy, Ella. Like I then nor now had no interest in money or power or prestige, which I think a lot of entrepreneurs have interest in those things. I don't give a shit. I really don't. I don't need money, and I don't need like the TechCrunch article about how I sold my company for gobs of money, or like I don't need any of that. And yet the things that that money represents, say, like I would very happily take every dollar that I make if and when I sell my company and give it all to charity immediately. Like I don't need the cash, but what I do want is that flag to show society, like, fuck off and let me live my life. Like, let me be impulsive, crazy, high energy James, because it works. If I fail, then maybe I'm just like a little bit too high energy, would be hypomanic, impulsive, like nut. And if I succeed, then I'm a creative visionary who, when he puts his creativity into something, it blows up, baby. So I thought it was a destination. I thought it was something that I was meant to chase, and I was going to get there, and that was going to feel good. But what I actually learned is that, like life, and again, this is a truism, it's this concept of chopping wood. Like the best lessons I've learned are finding the calm in the chaos, of finding the satisfaction in a busy day or a busy schedule, finding the joy in not quite succeeding yet, and learning how to then take that and use it to love myself. Can you hear me?
Yeah, totally. No, I wanted you to finish the thought. Sorry.
Yeah, like taking like I learned to love myself as an entrepreneur first, which helped me love myself as a human second. Like I learned to be like, I'm actually proud of what we've done, even though we haven't overwhelmingly succeeded yet, even though like a lot of untrained eyes could look at what I've built and like be objectively unsure if like, is my company succeeding or not? I don't know. Like, it's kind of still a small thing. I don't know. I don't know how like you, for example, if I took you through our financials and I took you through everything, if you'd walk away being like, wow, that's amazing. Or if you'd be like, ooh, that's a lot smaller than like, that's kind of like not that impressive. Right. But I'm really proud of it. I'm really happy with it. I really, and most of all, I really enjoy it. Like I love my life and I love the company. Like I love this little ecosystem I've built. I love talking to you right now. And I love what my next meeting is going to be. And I love what my meeting before this one was. I just love my day every day. Like I've found something that makes me happy. And that piece of like, I don't give a fuck if this succeeds or fails. I really don't. Like I've let go of that. I was ready to sell my company, when COVID, like before COVID hit. And I really grappled with that. And I really had to look myself in the mirror and like let go, because selling it for a loss would mean, even though other people might be like, you got an exit, that's a win. The reality is I failed. I lost money on this assignment. I lost. It could have been really big. It could have been something, and it wasn't. And the idea in my head versus what happened in the world were different, and I lost. And I had to come to peace with that. And so when COVID hit and the people that were going to buy my company for money, but less than has been invested in the company, my offers went away. And the only reason I'm sitting here talking to you right now, or at least still as a founder, is because COVID forced me to keep going. I was done. So I've come to peace. I've looked death in the eye, and I was at peace. I was ready to die. I was ready. Come to peace. And so now I'm sort of on borrowed time. It's like people that have a near-death experience. I'm like, this is just gravy, baby. Like this is just extra shit that I didn't think I was going to have. And that's enabled me to love my company as an entity unto itself, not as a shadow of my insecurity, but as its own thing. I'm proud of that. It's like watching a kid grow up and realizing that it's not just your child, it's actually its own thing, and being proud of it for doing its own thing. And that's where I'm at right now in the journey. And that's enabled me to look at myself as a human being and be more okay with who I am. So it's been pretty cool. Like the past year has been, I hate my company. I'm failing. I need to sell it. I suck. And then on top of that, I hate myself. And I'm not happy and proud of myself, and I suck. And now the inverse is true. 1 short year later, I'm proud of my company, and I'm proud of myself, and I love myself. And that's been like lots of therapy, lots of advisors on a professional note have helped me get there. But I've gotten there on both, which has been just like, my life is just completely different than it was a year ago.
To the point of COVID too, it's impossible to overstate the economic devastation and how so many people are losing jobs. And some of the more optimistic people might be like, oh, well, maybe this is now the time that I start my own company and that I kind of venture out into this world. What advice would you have for them, especially, when everything just kind of seems so uncertain?
I think it's a good idea. Like there's a temptation to spend more money than you have to grow. It's the same thing. It's life, right? Like people in calm waters, like we've been we were in the biggest bull market in history from 2009 to COVID, right? Like we were just, stock market was ripping for like 11 years, longest in history. And in that bull market, people get fat. People are like spending money they don't have. The average American can't deal with a surprise $500 bill. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But one of it is just complacency, that we as a country, writ large, are sort of complacent. When you start a company in a recession, whereas you might have been tempted prior to spend a little bit more money than you should have, or like take risks, that you're kind of in a high stress, high alert stance, because you know how precarious everything is. Like, how fucked the economy is, how hard it's going to be. So you enter into it with an appropriate amount of respect. Like entrepreneurs, myself, I compare it to like boogie boarding sometimes, because as a kid, I just have these memories of like going out to waves that were like 5 foot tall waves and like boogie boarding and having a great time, and then timing it wrong and getting swallowed by a wave and like feeling like I was going to drown and die. And then having to go and sit next to my mom for like 10 minutes and like be like, do I want to go back out there? Like that was really hard and scary. And like, I don't think I can do that again. And sometimes working up the courage, and other times just being like, no, I'm not going back in the water. Like that fucking sucked. I still have salt in my nose. Entrepreneurs get spun like that. Like you start out cocky and you're like, ooh, I have a great idea and my mom thinks it's a good idea. My friends do. And I've made 20 sales and I'm the man. And then it's like, nope, you fucking suck and you're going to get spun. And can you handle that? And so if you go in with an appropriate respect for the ocean, like you're like, I might get spun and I got to be careful, then you'll be more ready when you do. So I think starting during a recession, my advice would be like, be really, really tight, which would be my advice always, but be doubly tight, be doubly cautious with every dollar you spend, be doubly considered, launch in a smaller, more modest way. Like use this recession or perhaps depression as an impetus to build a company as tightly and modestly as you possibly can. And then when the market starts improving, my take for what it's worth is that the stock market is wildly inflated right now. We're going to see a correction in the next 6 months, and there's going to be an L-shaped recovery, not a V-shape. So it's not going to bounce right back. It's going to take 5 to 7 years to kind of get back to where the S&P 500 was. So, if you started a company today, it's taken me 5 years to get to a place of quasi maturation. Like it might take you the same. And by the time you finally get there, the sea will be rising with you, right? Like the economy will be on the rebound. And then with all your discipline and knowledge and understanding of how the world and entrepreneurship works, then the economy will be on an upswing and you'll be doubly successful. So I think it's a great time to start a company if you're fucking careful.
That note of, having, I guess, humility would be a really good word to recognize that you're going to have these ups and downs, and especially the losses. What advice would you have for people to be able to weather that? Because getting feedback can be scary and a lot of people take it personally.
It takes a special kind of person to be cocky enough, and it's not really cocky, it's just like really, it's like fundamental belief, right? Like I didn't really have belief of self, but I had vision, I had passion. So you need one vector that drives you up. Like it's either a cockiness or deep self-belief, or it's a deep belief in your idea or deep passion for your idea. And that's what gets you up every morning. And then a deep humility for when you get punched in the face. So if you're too cocky, too irreverent, you'll fail, because when you get negative feedback, you don't deal with it so well. But if you're too weak and too receptive to the feedback, you'll just get fucking pounded into the ground. So it takes a special kind of person. And I had to work on this a lot, right? Like, because I've had elements of not loving myself nearly enough. And some would call me obstinate, like I'm not the best at taking feedback. So I've had to work on it from both sides, like getting better at getting pummeled and learning from it, but also getting better at waking up and being like, I believe in myself. And that might be the hardest thing about entrepreneurship, is like walking that tightrope between deeply believing and also being humble enough that when you're wrong, you can admit it without any insecurity and learn from it, and know that getting pummeled is actually a good thing, because it shapes you're like, oh, that feedback, if I implement it thoughtfully, will make it better, so I get pummeled less in the future. Like failure is just removing branches of the conditional tree. I could go this way, this way, this way, this way. Okay, so I went this way and I failed. Now I have fewer options. What does that mean? It means I have a higher chance of success. Now I can't go this way. I can't go, okay, so now I can pick a path, which is the right path. And then you come to another branch, another fork, and the same thing happens. So failure is part of it, but you need to, when you fail, learn from your failure and be modest, but also be headstrong enough to be like, I still fucking believe. Like, yeah, I know I just failed here, but the idea is right. right? Belief in the macro.
And to circle back to something else too, when you first got your start, you had that seed investment from your dad, the $16,000 on top of your $4,000. And a lot of people who are starting out right now probably have less than zero. I know you just mentioned that people should really start their companies, really, really tight. But what if people just don't have anything? Is there a way to kind of climb out of that?
Yeah, I mean, like, it's never been easier, right? Like, I don't know. I had a friend who called me the other day with an app idea. And I'm like, it sounds like what you got to do, man, is just start a Google Sheet, like, you know what a Google Sheet is, Ella? Yeah. Start a Google Sheet and have like different people invited to it and they can like add to it. And like, I basically explained to him like how the functionality of his app, that if you were to build it right, would cost 100K. Like most people think a lot of these things are easy. Like building an app is like, oh, I can do that in like a month for like 5K. It's like, no, it takes like, if you're going to do it right, it's, and what I mean by that is like, building it the correct way, but also getting feedback and optimizing and optimizing and optimizing and optimizing and optimizing. The first version's never the right version ever. So if you're going to do it right, it takes 6 months and 100K. It's not going to take a month and 5. So why don't you not do that? Because you only have 5K or 10K and you're going to lose. And why don't you build it as a Google Sheet and do all of your losing for free? It's only your time and your friend's time and a free service, which is Google Sheets. And then you eat shit a lot. You'll either decide you're not an entrepreneur and you'll be like, this sucks, and you'll quit, or you'll keep going. And then when you're ready to build your app, you have all these insights. You know what to build. So your first version of your app's actually like the 10th version of your company. So now when you do fire that bullet, it's going to work, as opposed to if you fired it the first time, it wouldn't. So if you have no money, great. Again, like I honestly think that works to your advantage. Like it sounds ridiculous to say, but I really mean it. The fact that I had money from the outset meant that I could swing really hard at the ball. And I didn't know what the fuck I was doing. And so the ball ended up way in the bushes. If all you have is a little putter and you can just hit the ball 5 feet, it will move in the right direction towards the pin. And if it is a little bit off, it will only go 6 inches off from the target, right? And that's really different than hitting it with a driver and being 400 yards in the wrong direction. So I do think like starting small using free tools, Google like no code. No code is a fancy way of saying like no code. Like don't build an app, don't build a software platform, don't build a website to sell your coffee. Like do it in the cheapest, simplest way. Spend less than $100 a week, right? If you don't have a grand in the bank, you probably can't start a company. But if you have a grand or a couple grand, like you definitely can.
And then my last question for you. If you could go back in time, for some reason, I like this concept of just being able to go back and reflect on this, but
You're a time traveler.
if you could go back and talk to that you at We Heart It from 5 years ago, what's the one thing you would tell him?
I think it's a lot of the lessons we've discussed. It's like, it's hard, right? Like all of these things you have to kind of calibrate, you have to feel. Like you have to learn what it feels like to trust yourself and then also to take on feedback. Like you have to be able to do that. You have to be able to like trust other people and let them work for equity or for free and like let them take on risk. You have to be able to, say no to things, even though you're really tempted by a lot of the delicious options that lie before you. Like, no, I'm not going to do 80% of that. Like all of these things I've learned, I wish I could go back and tell myself. But paradoxically, it's through eating all that shit. And this is the truism of entrepreneurship, right? Like why they talk about the badge of failure. Like, oh, you failed. That's a good thing. I don't really agree with that, Ella. Like I think a true entrepreneur finds a way no matter what. That's my opinion. But the reason that entrepreneurship failure is a badge of pride is because it proves that you got burned a couple times and you've learned real lessons from really being in the trenches. So part of me wants to go back and tell my old self all the things to avoid, but part of me is happy that I didn't avoid those things and that I got burned 16 ways to Sunday. because it made me so much better and smarter and stronger now as an entrepreneur, but as I said, also as a person.
Absolutely. Well, those were my questions. Thank you so much for your time and your insights.
Those are my answers. Thanks so much for your time and your insights.
Yes. Sorry, you kind of tap into like